Good evening. Can everybody hear me back there? All right. The Iowa State Committee on Lectures is very pleased to sponsor tonight's talk by Daniel Burstein. Mr. Burstein is a freelance writer who probably knows more about Cambodia and the plight of its people than any other American journalist. 2 years ago, Dan Burstein became the first American to visit Cambodia since the end of the American War there back in 1975. His invitation to visit came from Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge government, which was overthrown last year when Vietnamese troops invaded Cambodia. Since that first trip, Burstein has returned to the area several times. His latest trip took place in February of this year when he organized a team of American journalists to visit guerrilla zones still controlled by the Khmer Rouge. Dan Burstein's articles have appeared in a variety of American newspapers and on several networks, such papers as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Christian Science Monitor. He's also been editor of The Call, a Chicago-based socialist newspaper. Now, following tonight's talk, he'd be very happy to entertain questions from you in the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel Burstein.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here tonight and have a chance to talk with people at Iowa State. Can everybody here? Good. I live in Chicago, and in Chicago we've had a lot of publicity about the things that were done in Iowa over the last year or so to help raise money for Cambodian refugees, for humanitarian aid for the Cambodian people through the Iowa Shares program and others. And I understand that per capita, Iowa has been among the top states in the country in raising money for that purpose. And I think that's a very commendable endeavor, and I think it's an indication of the concern that people here obviously must have for the situation that's now transpiring in Indochina. So I appreciate being in this community of people and sharing with you tonight some of my thoughts and some of my observations that I've had a chance to accumulate over the last couple of years of visiting Cambodia and trying to study the very complex situation taking place there. I should say, by the way, I'll probably use the terms Cambodia and Kampuchea interchangeably tonight. Kampuchea is the name that the Khmer people have given to their country, and I think the warring parties on all sides of the conflict use that term to describe their own country, and it's becoming increasingly used in the Western press, although mainly you still see Cambodia used. So out of habit, I'll probably go back and forth between the two. What I'd like to do is speak for a while about some of the major issues that are involved in the conflict now taking place in Kampuchea. I'd then like to show some videotape that was made during my visit to the Khmer Rouge-held areas in February. And then I would like to spend a good amount of time trying to answer your questions. Because of all the news stories that I've been involved in, of all the things I've covered, I've found the Cambodia crisis perhaps the most complicated, the most controversial, the most difficult to understand, especially from the perspective of America. And I think we should try to spend as much time as we can having some exchange back and forth and hearing questions and trying to delve more deeply into the issues that you would like to hear more about tonight. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Apocalypse Now, but if you saw it, you know that the dramatic turning point in the film comes when the protagonists in the movie go upriver and pass from Vietnam into Cambodia. And of course the film is set theoretically during the American War that took place in Cambodia from 1970 to 1975. And it's a film that suggests as the boat goes upriver, things darken and the climate gets more overgrown, and the morality contradictions and the questions about power and political relationships and personal relationships seem to grow more and more complex. And there's a sense in this movie that as you go upriver into Cambodia, something very confusing and mysterious is taking place. That has been my experience traveling back and forth to Cambodia in the last few years, trying to study it from abroad, trying to talk to refugees who've come out of that experience, trying to talk to other journalists who have gone into the war zones and seen the situation, trying to talk to different people who've been in and around different sides of the conflict. It is an extremely complicated situation, and I would caution against any simplistic analyses. And I will try to, as I say, share with you my views on the situation, which I hope will not, in speaking tonight, I can only convey to you a small portion of the relevant facts and information to really grasp an understanding of what is happening there. The gist of the Cambodia crisis, as I see it, is that there is a nation of perhaps 7 or 8 million people at one time, now maybe only 6 million, whose very nationhood is at stake. The existence of a Kampuchean people seems to be hanging very much in the balance at the present moment. There are people who have been through now 10 years of intensive war. First, 5 years of an American war. Then 3 years of a very complicated situation in which the Pol Pot government, in its attempt to carry out a very radical vision of the revolutionary society it saw building up, committed tremendous excesses and crimes in the course of trying to do this, and left a population significantly devastated, both through actually through killings as well as through internal contradictions that arose between the various factions and power groupings inside the country, including very early on through that whole period of 1975 to 1978, a very shadowy and underground conflict that was being played out even at that time between Cambodian forces and pro-Vietnamese forces who were fighting each other for power and for control of the state apparatus of the army and of the Communist Party structure. And much of this contradiction led to some of the, in various ways, to the massacres and to the tremendous bloodshed that I think most people here have heard a great deal about in our press here that took place from 1975 to 1978. Following that time, the Vietnamese government moved approximately 200,000 troops now into Cambodian territory and have succeeded in virtually occupying all the major cities of Cambodia, controlling most of its highways, controlling most of its waterways, and establishing in the capital city of Phnom Penh a more or less, by all accounts, puppet regime headed by a fellow by the name of Heng Samrin. And for the last 2 years since this took place, Cambodia has continued to know nothing but war. The Pol Pot forces overthrown, went back to the jungle guerrilla bases from which they had waged their war against the United States earlier, and immediately dug in and began building a guerrilla resistance to the Vietnamese occupation and are continuing to do so. And other forces are also involved in the guerrilla fighting. And the Vietnamese have repeatedly committed more and more troops to the area and have still not succeeded in eradicating the resistance. In fact, in a very ironic twist of events, what we are seeing today is in many ways a repetition of the events that took place in the American War in Cambodia earlier. Cambodia has been called Vietnam's Vietnam because much like the US government under Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, there is a sense that to eradicate this resistance, one must constantly send more and more troops. The troops don't meet with success, the troops suffer a heavy casualty rate, and the conclusion drawn at home is send more troops, and there's continuing escalation of the war going on. At the same time, the Vietnamese, who were masters of fighting the guerrilla war against the United States and against the French before that, and succeeded finally in liberating their entire country after a 30-year war in 1975, now are finding themselves, militarily speaking, in much the same position in Cambodia that the United States found itself in Vietnam earlier. The Vietnamese, whose main strength as warriors came in fighting the guerrilla battle, are now trying to fight positional warfare in Cambodia, and it's the Khmer Rouge who are fighting a guerrilla war. So the Vietnamese find themselves in much the same way the United States did, bogged down with heavy armor, bogged down with tanks that can't pass during the muds and monsoons of the rainy season. They're relying on heavy aerial bombardment and air support. And of course, just as the U.S. found out in Indochina in the rainy season, you can't see through the cloud cover to find the targets to drop the bombs. So the Vietnamese are finding themselves in the same position that the U.S. did, of able to control the strategic points, but unable to control the countryside in between. And in the countryside in between, a war continues to rage. So the Cambodian people have been through extremely hard times, and it's my conviction, based on what I've seen of the situation, that just as Richard Nixon once vowed to fight to the last Cambodian in Cambodia, I think the perception in Hanoi and in Moscow today is much the same. That Vietnam, with very intensive moral and material and political support from the Soviet Union, should go ahead and fight to the last Cambodian if necessary, if that's what it takes to bring Cambodia under Vietnamese control. I think this is at least my perception of what the meaning of events there are. This leaves, there are approximately 1 million Cambodians who've become refugees from this conflict. The official statistics show about 700,000 refugees in Thailand, and I believe those statistics to be somewhat of an underestimation. The intensive crisis that people probably heard much about last year, where we were seeing on the news every night these horrifying pictures of children dying in mothers' arms, of emaciated bodies, of the most miserable kinds of conditions imaginable, have been somewhat alleviated by the international aid that has been generated on behalf of Cambodia. But I would not by any means say that that battle is over. I have seen reports in the press that indicate that there is no more starvation in Cambodia. To my knowledge, that is not true. There is still widespread starvation, not only in Cambodia, but still going on in the refugee camps. The situation for the refugees remains very tenuous. Inside Cambodia, the situation is worse on all sides. There is still no functioning economy in the Vietnamese-controlled areas. And in the guerrilla areas, the amount of aid that's coming in is barely more than a trickle in terms of food and medicine. I visited one guerrilla base of the Khmer Rouge, where 90% of the people living there were suffering from malaria. I think the situation in various parts of the Vietnamese-controlled areas is equally bad. So what's happening here is that an entire people with a very rich and glorious history that goes back several thousand years find their very existence as a people and as a nation at stake. Prince Sihanouk, the very charismatic one-time leader of the Cambodian people, has written in his recent book that he thinks in very short order there will be no more Cambodia. There will be no more Cambodian people as such. So we face, in looking at the situation, a tremendously frightening specter from the humanitarian viewpoint. And I think this is the sentiment on which much of the money and funds have been raised to send aid to Cambodia, and many doctors and nurses and humanitarian workers of all kinds have volunteered to go there. But we also have a political crisis of tremendous proportions that exists side by side with the moral crisis and the humanitarian issues. Because in Cambodia, I think we will find a microcosm of the major political issues and contradictions that exist on a global scale. Earlier in the 1960s and the 1970s, when the American war was going on in Indochina, many of the contradictions of the world at that time were reflected in the microcosm of that war. Today, I think a changed international situation is reflected in what's happening once again in that part of the world. Because we now have a situation where the United States is more or less, at this time, a relatively idle spectator to the situation in Indochina. It's playing a certain role, and a contradictory role in some ways, but given the course of events, the United States government is at this time a relatively idle spectator to the events there. And the moving force, the contradiction that's brought to bear there, it would seem to me, is the thrust of a combined effort, which is being spearheaded, of course, by Vietnamese troops, but appears to be significantly directed politically from the Soviet Union, a Soviet-Vietnamese desire to create a sphere of influence in Indochina and perhaps throughout Southeast Asia, much as the United States attempted to do this and successfully did this 10 or 15 years ago. Here we begin to look at global issues that are involved. The Khmer Rouge resistance is fond of pointing out, you might not like us very much. You might not like our government or the way we did things when we were in power. You might think we're butchers or bloodthirsty devils or whatever you want to call us. But if you let the Vietnamese overrun us, if you let the Soviet Union make Indochina a Soviet sphere of influence, don't you realize that the Thailand won't be able to hold out? Don't you realize that the Vietnamese army is far superior to the Thai army? And once Cambodia is overrun, there's no buffer anymore between Vietnam and Thailand. And the argument goes, if the Soviet-Vietnamese expansion is not checked at Cambodia, ultimately the resistance of all the Southeast Asian countries known as the ASEAN group will not be able to stand up to this push. And Prince Sihanouk, when I talked with him in January of 1979, right after the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, he said to me, there's a French proverb we have that we use in Cambodia. It comes from the French classic literature. And he says, the proverb goes, the more you eat, the bigger your appetite gets. And he says that after the Vietnamese are through swallowing up Cambodia, they will swallow up Thailand, and after they've swallowed up Thailand, they will swallow up Malaysia, and he says their appetite knows no bounds. Well, I don't know if that's an accurate scenario to predict, but certainly the possibility of something along that order is suggested by the play of events there. So we have, in looking at Cambodia, not only tremendous moral and humanitarian issues to confront, but issues that fairly directly affect the peace and stability of the world we're living in, and even the peace and stability of our own country. I think everybody is aware of the extent to which the world economy has become an economy of interdependence. Particularly the Western countries share a tremendous amount of reliance upon each other and on a global developed economy. I think everybody's become aware over the years of the importance of oil as an economic and political factor in the balance of power internationally. And I think that if you see, for example, Japan, of course, is not especially fond of the Khmer Rouge government. Japan is a fairly well-advanced, very much pro-capitalist government. They don't have much in common with socialists from Kampuchea, certainly not from what was perceived to be the Khmer Rouge government. And yet today, Japan stands very heavily and very forcefully behind the Khmer Rouge resistance and is providing millions of dollars of aid to the Khmer Rouge government and continues to extend diplomatic recognition to it. Why? Because without oil, Japan's economy doesn't function, and 90% of the oil that Japan gets has to go right through the Straits of Malacca and right around the South China Sea. And it's these strategic waterways that are directly threatened by continued Soviet-Vietnamese penetration of Indochina. So it becomes a very simple question to the Japanese leaders what side to take in this dispute. I'd like to briefly sketch out something about the different forces at work here, just so we'll be familiar and all speaking somewhat of the same language in this discussion, and say something about about each one. First of all, I'd like to talk about the indigenous Kampuchean forces that exist in this conflict. I've mentioned Mr. Heng Samrin. Mr. Heng Samrin is the nominal head of the government in Phnom Penh that is essentially a pro-Vietnamese, Vietnamese-aligned government. It took power in January of 1979 following the invasion, and by a fairly wide consensus of observers, has failed to develop any kind of significant indigenous power base inside the country. It exists primarily on the strength of the armed firepower of the Vietnamese. It was said at one time that there were perhaps only 20 people in the entire Heng Samrin central government in Phnom Penh. There were only 20 Cambodians who could be counted as part of this administrative structure. Recently, there have been several defections of key people from the Heng Samrin government who've even gone over to the other side, to the Khmer Rouge, or fled into Thailand as refugees. And furthermore, it's rumored that Mr. Heng Samrin himself is not a very powerful figure in all this, and that in fact, a fellow by the name of Pen Sylvan, who is the head of the newly formed Cambodian Communist Party, who has had extensive training in Hanoi, and is seen much more as the Vietnamese man on the spot, is the real power behind the scenes. I am told, and I have not been on the Vietnamese and Heng Samrin controlled areas of Cambodia, but I am told that in those areas you'll see, for example, in a regional structure or in a village structure, there'll be 200 Vietnamese soldiers and one Heng Samrin government representative. And in most cases, the one representative will be acting as a translator for the Vietnamese soldiers. He'll be given a high title and a high post, but in fact, the only work he's doing is really translating for the Vietnamese conquering army. This is generally speaking, this is one side of the conflict. The side that's referred to as the Khmer Rouge, which calls itself the Government of Democratic Kampuchea, was formerly headed by Pol Pot, and it's his name that's associated most frequently with this side. Although in December of last year, Pol Pot was removed as prime minister of this government and replaced by Mr. Khieu Samphan, in an effort, I think, to appeal to the world, which had been so critical of the Pol Pot regime, and say, look, we're acknowledging some of the error of our ways here, and we're trying to show our recognition of this fact by actually removing Pol Pot as the prime minister. The Khmer Rouge forces number perhaps at the outside 50,000 troops that they're capable of putting in the field, guerrilla troops, which means that they're tremendously overpowered by the Vietnamese inside their own country. But as guerrillas, they know the country better. They're able to fight in small units. In fact, the areas that I saw, they were fighting primarily in units of 6 or 8 soldiers at a time. They were capable of fanning out throughout the whole country. And from a defensive position, they're able to inflict very heavy casualties and very heavy damage on the Vietnamese. They're able to blow up roads, bridges. They're able to strike even inside Phnom Penh. And they have recently, in fact, they bombed the Soviet embassy inside Phnom Penh. So they're fairly mobile and fairly capable of continuing to inflict severe damage on the Vietnamese. I would say, however, that their ability to turn the tide and actually win a victory in the situation is fairly remote. That would require, at the very least, a tremendous consensus among Cambodians that the Khmer Rouge force represented them or that they were willing to enter into some kind of united front situation with the Khmer Rouge. And I would say at this point that sentiment does not exist very broadly among Cambodian people either in the refugee camps or inside the country. I would say the Khmer Rouge have a significant base of support, probably a much greater base of support than the Western press accounts generally give them credit for. But I would think that they would not be capable of significantly turning the tide in the battle until the Cambodian people as a whole see them, or whatever new force emerges with them as a part of it, as a banner of national unity under which they are prepared to unite and fight together. For example, there are other fighting groups. One of them is referred to as the Khmer Rouge, which is also fighting the Vietnamese, but is opposed to both the Vietnamese and the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge number anywhere from 12 to 13 distinct factions of Khmer Rouge groupings, and each one has a slightly different political outlook. As far as I understand, the most effective one is headed by a fellow by the name of Son Sann, who was a former deputy prime minister in Sihanouk's government. And this one has put the most soldiers in the field and has done the most actual fighting against the Vietnamese. These Khmer Rouge groups are based primarily along the Thailand-Cambodia border. Son Sann has sometimes talked about having some kind of coalition with the Khmer Rouge. And I'm told that at this point, earlier in the fighting, the Son Sann troops were sometimes fighting with the Khmer Rouge troops, fighting over food, fighting over supplies, fighting over territory. And I understand that has now stopped, and they're no longer fighting each other, but they haven't yet agreed to fight together in a coordinated way against the Vietnamese. And other of the Khmer Rouge groups continue to fight both the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese. And then there's Prince Sihanouk, who is looked at by the outside world as the one force that can unite the Cambodian people, although I doubt he has that much popular support among Cambodians. He has a lot of support in the United States and in France and in Japan and in Southeast Asia, but not very much support inside Cambodia, which is where it really counts. He has gone back and forth between living in North Korea and living in China. He's in China at the moment. He's gone back and forth between being allied with the Khmer Rouge, denouncing the Khmer Rouge, denouncing the Vietnamese. He has generally taken a nationalist position of opposing any acceptance of a Vietnamese-dominated Cambodia. But I think it's fairly safe to say that since he has no troops, since he has no force of his own, until such a time as some kind of unity deal is worked out with the Khmer Rouge or with the Khmer Rouge together, Prince Sihanouk will not play much of a role in the actual political and military situation there. This is something about the indigenous forces that are involved in this conflict. The outside powers also have to be looked at. First and foremost, Vietnam. Why are 200,000 Vietnamese troops in Kampuchea? Why is a country which has been fighting a war of its own for 30 years and finally had peace come in 1975, why does it find it necessary to be engaged in another war? This is a very complicated question. If the representatives of the Vietnamese government were here to speak for themselves, I'm sure they would tell you that the reason they are doing this is because Pol Pot kept invading and stealing away pieces of territory of Vietnam, because they couldn't stand to see what was happening to their brothers and sisters in Cambodia suffering under Pol Pot's terrible abuses, and because Pol Pot was really a puppet of China, and Vietnam could not have a puppet of China living on its border. This is the gist of the argument the Vietnamese make for why they've moved into Kampuchea. I don't think it's, they may say that, but I don't think that's really the reason they've done this. After all, if the problem was some border incursions by Pol Pot, then they could have moved their troops in and smashed Pol Pot and moved out, which they have not done. In fact, they've continued to beef up their forces month after month, sending more and more troops, committing heavier and heavier armaments. And I don't think their concern about their brothers and sisters in Cambodia proves to be true in light of the fact that very little has changed inside Cambodia in terms of if the Cambodian people were supposed to get any new freedoms or new economic benefits out of this situation. They certainly haven't. And in fact, the continued flow of refugees out of the Vietnamese areas and into Thailand, I think, reflects the fact that even in the Vietnamese-controlled areas, the people, if they have a chance, would choose to escape rather than stay and live in that situation. And the China question, I think, is more complicated, but I think there too the Vietnamese don't have much of an argument because, after all, it was not Cambodia that invaded Vietnam, it was Vietnam that invaded China, and the kind of defense, Vietnam that invaded Cambodia, the kind of defense of the logic that it's necessary to take a preemptory strike in order to keep something from happening is fairly thin and flimsy logic when it's not backed up by any hard evidence. I would say that Vietnam, as a country of 50 million or more people, with 1.5 million men under arms, with what's reputed to be the third strongest army in the world, with $10 billion of equipment left on the field by the United States military in 1975, and a tremendous influx of new military equipment from the Soviet Union, I would say it did not have much to fear from Pol Pot's 80,000-man army from the 6 or 7 million Cambodians. More likely, it seems to me, that the Vietnamese move into Cambodia comes as a confluence of factors. There is a fairly good case to be made for a historic Vietnamese tendency to dominate Indochina, going back many, many years. There's quotes from old Vietnamese kings in the 1830s, who's a very famous king who talks about how much he hates the Cambodians, and he thinks they should all be cut up with knives and put to death. And this historic antagonism, which exists on both sides, I should say. The Cambodians call the Vietnamese, when they speak in their own language about the Vietnamese, they call them Yun, which means basically savages. And this kind of strongly antagonistic national sentiment exists on both sides of this border and on both sides of this conflict. But the Vietnamese have always been the strong power in the region, the biggest country, the most developed economically, the most developed culturally, politically. When the French colonized Indochina, the way they colonized Cambodia and Laos was largely by first training a civil service made up of Vietnamese and then moving Vietnamese administrators into Cambodia and Laos to control the situation. Cambodia has always been seen as the rural rice-growing lands, whereas Vietnam has been seen as more heavily industrialized. And these kind of contradictions exist, fostering a certain conception, even going back to the political program of the Vietnamese communists when they first founded their party in 1930, which called ultimately for building a federation of the Indo-Chinese countries into one entity. And it's been argued by many scholars, and certainly very strongly by the Khmer Rouge,